In Rome, cruelty wasn't chaos. It was policy. When a slave woman ran, her punishment wasn't chosen by her master, but dictated by law. The sentence, 3 letters seared into her forehead. FVG, fugitiva, runaway. Rome didn't just brand her body. It branded the idea of freedom itself. Because in the empire of law, pain was paperwork. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Year 112 AD. At the edge of a Roman estate, a captured woman is dragged through the dirt by 2 guards. Her feet bleed from stones. Her wrists are bound with rope. For 3 days, she had hidden among olive trees, surviving on rainwater and hope. A hope that the law would never find her. But Rome's law finds everyone. Inside a small workshop, an officer of the empire waits. His title is stigmata, an official position authorized by the state. He is not a torturer by passion. He is an employee. His duty, to brand fugitives according to legal code. Behind him, a fire glows in the forge, heating iron rods until they turn white. On the wall hangs a wooden board listing recent punishments, names, owners, and reasons for branding. Everything is documented. The woman is forced to kneel. The stigmata gives no speech, no accusation, no mercy. His authority is administrative, not emotional. He takes the iron from the flames, presses it to her forehead, and counts slowly to 10. The sound, a violent hiss. The smell, burnt flesh and oil. The crowd, silent. When the iron is lifted, the mark remains. FVG. Under Roman law, the act of fleeing was not rebellion. It was theft of labor, a violation of property value. The punishment was not meant to kill, but to label. The empire's solution to disobedience was visibility. She could never again walk among citizens unnoticed. Her face declared her crime before she spoke a word. Archaeological finds confirm the bureaucracy behind this cruelty. Clay tablets record payments to stigmata officials. Slave collars recovered from ancient sewers bear inscriptions like, "Hold me, for I flee," or "I belong to Marcus, return me." The branding wasn't random punishment, it was accounting. Each scar closed a financial entry, an injury disguised as justice. Women were branded more often than men. Their bodies were considered weaker, easier to display, and more useful as warnings. Public brandings were sometimes held in markets, where other slaves were ordered to watch. The message was clear. If the empire owned your skin, it could rewrite it. Some tried to hide the scar beneath hair or pigment. When discovered, the law demanded a second brand, this time on both cheeks. Repeat, offenders were classified as visible property, condemned to permanent disfigurement. Rome didn't fear the escape of a few women. It feared the idea that they could. That fear became law, and that law was burned into flesh for centuries. But this was only the first punishment. The next would not mark the skin, it would break the body. Where the branded became chained, and shame became architecture. After branding came the second punishment, the one every enslaved woman feared most. It was not designed to destroy the body, but to erase dignity. Rome called it ad januam vincere, to be chained at the gate. The meaning was literal. the punishment turned the human body into a public sign of obedience. Imagine a Roman villa, white columns, mosaic floors, the smell of wine and incense. At the front stands the iannua, the main gate, the symbolic boundary between the master's private property and the public world. It was here, where every guest entered and every slave passed, that punishment became display. When a woman fled and was captured, her master could request that she be secured at the threshold. A slave collar was fastened around her neck, attached to an iron chain bolted into the wall. Sometimes her arms were bound, sometimes only her ankles, depending on how severe the offense was recorded. She would stand for hours, then days, in full view of neighbors, merchants, and strangers. To Romans, this was not cruelty. It was pedagogy, a lesson in hierarchy. The household gate was the point where the private met the public, and where the empire's ideology of control became visible. The chained woman reminded every passerby, citizen or slave, that freedom ended at the property line. Ancient writers describe the practice without moral hesitation. Plautus, in his comedies, jokes about slaves displayed at the door until their spirit cools. Seneca mentions it as a household corrective, a discipline by exposure. For them, humiliation was education. But archaeological evidence tells a different story. Iron rings fixed into villa walls, scratches at ankle height where shackles ground against stone, marks of rain corrosion, proof that these women stood outside through storms and heat alike. The punishment had a logic. Branding made the crime visible to the state. Chaining made it visible to society. Rome didn't need to kill its slaves to control them. It needed them to be seen suffering. The conditions were deliberate. No food for a day or more. Minimal clothing. The purpose was degradation, not labor. By daylight, she endured the stares of men and the laughter of children. By night, the cold bit into her skin as rats and insects crawled over her feet. The gate was both cage and stage. Worse than pain was time. Some were chained for weeks, allowed to sleep only standing, resting against the wall until their legs swelled. The metal bit deeper into skin each day, reopening wounds until they fused with rust. Physicians of the time describe fetid ulcers and infections that devoured flesh down to the bone. No one was allowed to help her. Fellow slaves risked the same fate if they offered water or comfort. The system enforced silence as much as submission. Roman law didn't just punish disobedience, it criminalized compassion. The ad Ianuam vincere punishment also carried sexual undertones. Female slaves were displayed partially undressed, tunic torn at the shoulder, hair disheveled, body presented as both warning and temptation. Passing men spat, mocked, or sometimes touched. The humiliation was total. To Roman moralists, this exposure served a civilizing function. The woman's body was turned into the architecture of obedience. The same wall that bore the empire's crest also bore her suffering. The psychological dimension was devastating. She wasn't just restrained, she was absorbed into the house's facade, a living ornament of submission. For guests entering the villa, her body was the first thing they saw, a silent emblem that order had been restored. This practice wasn't confined to villas. In cities like Pompeii and Ostia, historians found gatepost rings near slave markets and workshops, clues that the punishment extended into urban life. The visibility mattered more than the pain itself. Rome's cruelty depended on audience participation. Some records show that children of enslaved families were forced to watch. Roman authors note this with approval. The idea that fear imprinted early made loyalty permanent. The chained mother became a lesson for her own child, that disobedience was inherited sin. Philosophers rationalized it. Seneca called such punishments necessary corrections to preserve peace. Tacitus wrote of servitus, the condition of servitude, as a cornerstone of social order. Even compassion was reframed as disorder. To feel pity for the punished was to threaten the balance of empire. Yet the traces they left tell another truth. On one villa wall excavated in Campania, faint inscriptions scratched by another hand read, "Soror, resiste, sister, endure." Scholars believe it was etched by another slave passing by at night. A forbidden act of solidarity, erased the next day by overseers. But the scratch survived 2,000 years longer than the law. The Romans believed punishment purified the social body. But here, the social body was a human body, displayed, starved, and broken to preserve illusion. The chained woman was no longer a person or even a warning. She had become part of the empire's architecture. Flesh turned into structure. Pain turned into design. Every visitor who walked past her carried the message home. Rome's power was not maintained by armies or marble, but by ordinary eyes that kept looking away. The empire didn't invent cruelty. It standardized it. It made humiliation predictable, measurable, and lawful. Next came the third punishment, where humiliation turned into spectacle, where the runaway stopped being property and became entertainment. In the arena, her body would no longer stand for warning. It would be consumed for pleasure. After branding and chaining came the punishment no one survived. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It was Rome's cleanest method of erasing a human being, public, lawful, and entertaining. The Colosseum wasn't just a monument. It was the state's stage for obedience. Every execution inside it had a file, a record, a cost. For the enslaved who fled, the sentence was brief: fugitiva ad bestias. At dawn, she was led through the Porta Libitinensis, the gate of death. No trial, no defense. The guards tied her to a post in the sand, while above her, 50,000 spectators waited. The arena master raised a signal. The gate below creaked open. A lion, starved for days, stepped into the light. The crowd roared louder than the animal. They didn't see a woman. They saw law in motion. The punishment was meant to prove a single truth. Rome could make obedience beautiful. Pain was arranged, choreographed, and timed to please the public eye. The emperor watched from his box. Priests blessed the ground. Some executions reenacted myths. Europa devoured by a bull, Andromeda chained to a rock. Real women filled those roles, stripped and bound, their deaths repackaged as legend. The purpose was not vengeance, it was demonstration. By turning punishment into performance, Rome transformed law into ritual. Each drop of blood reaffirmed control, not chaos. Writers of the time didn't protest. Martial called these deaths theatre of justice. Seneca, uneasy but complicit, said the games teach citizens the cost of rebellion. Tacitus listed executions alongside public festivals, another form of civic duty. Cruelty had become grammar. The empire spoke through suffering. Behind the spectacle was administration. Animal keepers kept ledgers, feeding days, species, aggression levels. Arena workers cleaned the sand with shovels, spreading a thin new layer over the blood before the next act. Rome didn't hide its brutality. It archived it. Female captives faced an extra sentence. Before the beasts, guards mocked them, cutting their tunics, forcing gestures of shame. The exposure wasn't random. It reminded everyone that women's bodies were property, even in death. To violate them publicly was to reaffirm ownership. Once the animal struck, the crowd erupted again, not in horror, but relief. The system had performed itself. The empire could breathe easy, knowing that order still had an audience. Each event had an accountant. The cost of the animals, the guards, the blood cleanup, the sand. It was all entered in state ledgers under one heading: public order. Rome had turned death into a budget line. Even the corpses had value. Arena slaves dragged them out with hooks, sold the remains to tanneries or animal feed suppliers. No part of punishment went unused. Economy and cruelty fed each other perfectly. Archaeologists found inscriptions in amphitheaters reading, "Justice fulfilled by the people." The phrase appears on monuments, theatre tickets, and amphorae filled with sand from the games. Souvenirs of legality. Citizens didn't see horror. They saw proof that Rome still functioned. For the enslaved, the arena erased identity twice, first as property, then as entertainment. To die before thousands was the empire's final correction. A body destroyed publicly, so the idea of resistance could never return. Even philosophers accepted it as inevitable. Cicero called it discipline by sight. Seneca, who once wrote that the slave too is a man, never dared call for its end. The arena made the citizen complicit, not by force, but by fascination. Every cheer, every bet, every laugh turned cruelty into civic participation. Rome didn't rule only with armies, it ruled with audiences. When the games ended, the emperor stood, raised his hand, and smiled. The crowd shouted his name. Below them, workers dragged the body away. The sand was leveled, the stain covered. Tomorrow, it would happen again. Same ritual, new victim. To Rome, this was justice. To history, it was choreography. An empire maintaining order through rhythm, law, scream, silence, applause. The arena didn't destroy chaos, it performed it. That was the genius of Rome, to make brutality look like peace. But the next punishment was worse still. For those not killed, there was a fate colder than blood and louder than the crowd. The mines, where daylight and names disappeared forever. For those not sent to the arena, the empire reserved something slower. Damnatio in metallum, condemnation to the mines. No blood, no crowd, no applause, just darkness. Here, Rome didn't perform cruelty, it industrialized it. A decree recorded in the Digest of Justinian states plainly, "Those who flee shall be sent to labor underground until death relieves them. It was not metaphor. The punishment was permanent. Condemned women were stripped of identity, property, and name. Their chains were marked with the same 3 letters as the branded FVG. From that moment, they ceased to exist in any social sense, no longer persons, merely tools of extraction. The journey began with transport orders. Carts escorted by soldiers moved through Rome's southern roads towards Sardinia, Dalmatia, and Noricum, provinces rich in ore and death. Each cart carried supplies, records, and prisoners. No one ever returned. The mines themselves were pits of airless stone, narrow shafts carved by pickaxes, lined with moisture and dust. Inside, the temperature rose above 40 degrees. The air thickened with mercury, lead, and sulfur. Breathing became punishment. Roman administrators described these places not as prisons, but factories of obedience. The first descent was the last sight of sunlight. Once inside, torches flickered against wet walls, revealing hundreds of bodies moving in rhythm, lifting, breaking, carrying. Whips cracked in the dark to keep time. There was no day or night, only labor until collapse. The empire's logistics were precise. Every mine had overseers, metallari, paid by production output. Slave death was not a tragedy, it was a calculation. Records from Iberian and Sardinian sites show quotas for each worker, how much ore to extract before being replaced. A runaway caught and sent here was listed under laborum povina, punishment through work. It meant a sentence without end. Women suffered doubly. They hauled ore in baskets twice their weight, their bodies breaking under loads designed for men. When they slowed, the whip corrected them. Guards used sexual abuse as control, another form of ownership, one not written in law but understood by all. The air killed faster than the violence. Lead and mercury poisoning rotted gums. Blackened skin made the mind slip. Ancient physicians like Pliny the Elder noted miners lose their teeth, their sight, and their reason. Rome read this not as tragedy, but efficiency. Exhaustion meant progress. No burial was allowed. When a worker died, her body was dragged into a side shaft and sealed under rubble. The smell of decay mixed with metal dust. Those who survived had to keep digging beside the dead. A letter from a Roman tax officer found in Egypt describes these deaths without emotion. Losses recorded: 12 women, 7 men. The shafts continue without interruption. It was bureaucracy, not cruelty. The machine simply replaced parts. The mines turned human beings into numbers, and numbers into silence. Where the arena demanded spectators, the mines demanded none. Here, Rome didn't need the crowd, it needed results. Archaeology confirms the horror. At Rio Tinto in Spain and Alburnus Mea in Dacia, skeletal remains of women show compacted spines, fractured ribs, and fingers worn to bone. In some, mercury crystals are still embedded in teeth. They didn't die quickly. They corroded from within. Rome extracted more than ore. It extracted time. Every heartbeat, every breath was converted into imperial currency. The silver that paid soldiers, the iron that built legions, the gold that gilded temples. The empire's brilliance was its balance sheet, suffering on one side, splendor on the other. A perfect equation written in human cost. In literature, these mines barely exist. Historians mention them in a sentence. Philosophers skip them entirely. The absence is intentional. Rome's darkness was buried with its workers, but the ground remembers. In Sardinia, excavators found names scratched into the rock. Marcia fuet. Marcia was here. Vivat qui liber erit. May he live who will be free. They wrote in dust because they had nothing else left to claim. No one recorded their release dates, because there were none. Damnatio in metallum was a sentence beyond law, a slow execution without witnesses. A punishment designed not to end, but to disappear. When Rome's engineers inspected the mines, they didn't count people. They counted yield. Every ton of ore had a cost measured not in coin, but in bone. That is how empire sustains itself. Through labor so hidden, it becomes invisible even to memory. The branded woman sent below didn't die for disobedience. She died for productivity. Rome didn't waste her body. It used it to fuel its next monument. Her voice never reached the surface, but her silence became the empire's foundation. And above ground, in marble halls, senators spoke of order, virtue, and civilization, all paid for by the darkness that never ended. Next came the final punishment, not physical, but philosophical. The one no historian dared to name, when law itself became the crime. Rome's punishments ended with the body, but its greatest cruelty survived through the mind, through law, philosophy, and silence. This was the final punishment, to make atrocity sound reasonable. The Roman elite never saw themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as administrators of order. When Seneca wrote, "The slave too is a man," it wasn't rebellion, it was reassurance. He condemned cruelty in theory, then justified it in practice. He advised mercy, but owned hundreds. That contradiction, moral clarity without consequence, was Rome's true masterpiece. The empire no longer needed the whip or the iron. It needed belief. Every citizen had to accept that hierarchy was natural, that punishment preserved civilization. The same philosophers who wrote of reason and virtue drafted arguments defending slavery as a necessary system of balance. Cicero called it servitus naturae, the slavery of nature. He claimed some people were born to rule, others to serve, a cosmic division between power and obedience. And when law followed philosophy, cruelty became rational. That is how empires survive longest, not by violence, but by consensus. Once a system convinces people that injustice is stability, it no longer needs guards. It governs through silence. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius documented punishments, brandings, chains, executions, with precision, but without horror. They wrote as if describing weather. In their pages, pain was grammar, one line for a life. No adjectives, no outrage. That's how law works when it stops serving justice and begins serving memory. It records, it classifies, it absolves. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the backbone of Roman law, lists punishments for fugitivi in the same column as property taxes and trade tariffs. A runaway woman was a line item between livestock and logistics. Rome didn't hide its cruelty, it bureaucratized it. Philosophers gave this violence moral language, discipline, order, utility. Each word shaved the edge off reality. When you name torture as discipline, you don't see it. When you call slavery order, you protect it. And when you justify it as useful, you make it eternal. This was the empire's genius. Not cruelty, but vocabulary. By redefining horror as necessity, it transformed crime into custom. Silence did the rest. Ordinary Romans walked past chained women, past arenas, heard the screams from the mines, and said nothing. Not because they didn't know, because knowing changed nothing. When cruelty becomes routine, morality becomes noise. The Roman poet Juvenal once wrote, "We tolerate everything but the truth." He wasn't exaggerating. The truth that Rome's greatness was built on suffering threatened the myth of virtue. And virtue was the empire's most valuable export. Even Christianity, when it rose, absorbed the same logic. Early church fathers didn't abolish slavery, they sanctified obedience. Paul's letters advised, "Slaves, obey your masters." The theology changed, but the structure stayed. The law remained the same ledger, only the handwriting differed. Rome taught the world how to moralize domination. Every empire since has copied its syntax. Colonial decrees, plantation codes, prison regulations, all inherit Rome's language of lawful pain. The phrases change, but the structure endures. Order, stability, reform. Different words for the same silence. In the ruins of Pompeii, a tablet was found with a single inscription: Nullus liber, sine culpa. No one is free without guilt. It was likely written by a scribe, not a philosopher. But it defines the empire better than any Senate decree. Freedom, in Rome, required the suffering of someone else. Every road, every aqueduct, every arena was paved not just with stone, but with obedience. The system's brilliance was that everyone had a role: the slave, the master, the spectator, the philosopher, all complicit, all necessary. That's why the empire endured so long, not because of its armies, because of its explanations, because no one, from the senator to the servant, could imagine life without the system that crushed them both. And when the empire finally fell, its stones scattered, but its logic didn't die. Its laws became Europe's legal code. Its philosophy became education. Its hierarchy became the model of civilization. Rome didn't collapse. It replicated. The branded woman's mark, FVG, outlasted marble and empire alike. It reappeared in the colonial registry, the prison uniform, the factory ID. Every age finds its own way to write the same three letters. Every system finds a new word for runaway. The Romans believed law was eternal. They were right, but for the wrong reason. The law outlived them because we kept repeating it. We kept confusing order with justice, because silence is the only law that never changes. Next comes the reckoning. When archaeology, philosophy, and history converge to ask the question Rome buried: if cruelty can be codified, can civilization ever be innocent? Rome fell, its laws fractured, its palaces burned, its emperors forgotten. But the ground remembered everything. 2,000 years later, archaeologists found what the historians ignored: the evidence beneath the marble, bones, tools, chains, inscriptions. The empire's true library was buried, not written. In Sardinia, miners uncovered a tunnel sealed since the 2nd century. Inside, skeletons of women were found stacked like timber, each with shackles still clasped to the ankles. Mercury traces lined their teeth, proof they had died from poisoning. Not quickly, but slowly, cell by cell. No tombstones, no names, just residue of breath trapped in dust. In Ostia, near Rome's ancient port, another discovery. Fragments of iron collars engraved with the same phrases recorded by jurists. Teneme, quia fugi, hold me, for I flee. I am the property of Lucius. For centuries, these lines were thought to be metaphors. They were inventory labels. The empire that once documented every punishment in law had erased the punished from memory. Now, the bones wrote back. Archaeology did what philosophy refused to do. It took sides. Each excavation became an indictment. Every skeleton contradicted the official version of civilization. The historian Tacitus had once written, "The cruelty of our age shall be forgotten." He was wrong. Time didn't erase Rome's brutality. It fossilized it. The more ruins uncovered, the more the myth of virtue collapsed. What poets called order turned out to be organized violence. What jurists named discipline was simply fear repeated until it became custom. Museums across Europe now display these artifacts. Slave collars, shackles, branding irons. Visitors walk past them in silence. The labels say, domestic slavery, household punishment, imperial discipline. The language remains polite, the cruelty still bureaucratic. Even now, the documentation sanitizes the act. A collar isn't described as torture, it's an instrument of restraint. A branding iron isn't called a weapon, it's a mark of identification. 2,000 years later, the wording hasn't changed. Only the empire has. The bones reveal what text concealed, that Rome's cruelty wasn't the work of monsters, but of administrators. That the system's horror lay not in excess, but in efficiency. And that civilization's greatest achievement was to make atrocity sound reasonable. In the museum light, the iron gleams clean. But look closer. In its grooves are remnants of ash, skin, and carbon. The past never vanished. It oxidized. Archaeologists catalogue the evidence the same way Roman clerks once did. Numbered, tagged, classified. The difference is intent. The Romans recorded to justify. We record to understand. Or at least we claim to. But sometimes, the act of studying cruelty repeats it. When pain becomes data, the dead serve us again, not as slaves, but as exhibits. We inherit the same gaze Rome perfected, detached, informed, unfeeling. The question lingers, can we study horror without repeating its distance? Or does every reconstruction risk rebuilding the same hierarchy between those who observe and those who suffered? The most haunting discovery came from the catacombs near Naples. A wall etched with hundreds of small marks, each a tally. They form rows, columns, too orderly to be random. Carbon dating confirms they were made in the 1st century. Some archaeologists believe these were made by slaves marking days underground. Not prayers, not rebellion, just counting time in the dark. That's the difference between Rome's archives and theirs. Rome recorded punishment to measure control. The condemned recorded scratches to prove they existed. History kept Rome's words. The earth kept theirs. And now, modern civilization stands between the two, the written and the buried, unsure which one tells the truth. We admire Roman engineering, its law, its architecture, its reason. But every aqueduct was built by hands that bled. Every stone was raised by someone Rome had erased. The empire's genius wasn't conquest, it was concealment. The more we excavate, the clearer the pattern. Civilization doesn't destroy its crimes, it buries them deep enough to look like foundations. In 2014, an inscription was found near Hadrian's Wall in Britain. A simple fragment reading, FVG Femina. A runaway woman, nothing else. No date, no name. Just the same mark burned into skin 18 centuries before. Even at the edge of empire, the language of domination was identical. The mark outlived the body. The record outlived the witness. That is how Rome achieved immortality. The empire fell, but its grammar survived. The grammar of ownership, the tone of authority, the vocabulary of silence. Today, we stand in museums pointing at relics and call it history. But the ledger never really closed. We are still reading it, still cataloguing its pages, still speaking its words. Rome taught us that cruelty can be systemized, and systems can outlast morality. Its bones whisper the same question the laws tried to erase. If pain can be archived, can it ever be forgiven? Rome's legacy wasn't its armies, it was its order, and the lie beneath it. The empire didn't invent cruelty. It invented the moral language that made cruelty sound like virtue. Every civilization needs a story to justify its power. Rome's story was law. To the world, it offered a simple equation. Order equals morality. Obedience equals peace. Pain equals purification. That story outlived the empire. Roman law codified everything: property, punishment, family, even emotion. The jurists wrote that discipline was mercy, that correction was love. The state didn't say, "We torture." It said, "We reform." Every act of violence came wrapped in reason. A slave branded with iron was not brutalized, she was identified. A chained woman wasn't humiliated, she was restrained. An execution wasn't vengeance, it was justice served. Every euphemism preserved the illusion of civilization. That was Rome's most enduring invention. Not empire, not architecture, not law, but language. The language that hides violence behind virtue. Once that vocabulary exists, it never dies. It only evolves. When a society learns to justify its own cruelty, it no longer needs gods or emperors. It can function forever, quietly, efficiently, morally. Fear was the true foundation of Rome's moral order. It began as public terror, the site of punishment, then became internal, private, invisible. The citizen learned to fear disorder more than injustice. They watched others burn so they would not speak. They learned that silence was safety. By the 2nd century, the empire no longer needed executions to enforce loyalty. It had achieved something far more powerful: self-censorship, a population that policed itself in the name of virtue. Philosophers called it Pax Romana, Roman peace. But peace built on fear is only quiet violence. It was stability through trauma. an empire that punished rebellion with law and rewarded submission with survival. Seneca praised this peace as the stillness of reason. But it wasn't reason, it was resignation. The empire's genius was that it didn't rely on faith. It relied on repetition. If you repeat an idea often enough, that order is sacred, that hierarchy is natural. You no longer need soldiers, you need teachers. Rome trained its subjects to believe that justice and obedience were the same. That is why the empire never feared rebellion, only awakening. Centuries later, the same ideas resurfaced under new names: the medieval ordo, divine order; the colonial civilizing mission; the modern rule of law. Each claimed moral purpose. Each inherited Rome's grammar. The vocabulary of control remains unchanged. Stability, security, reform. Different words, same structure. Every empire since has used law to hide its violence, and morality to bless it. That is why Rome still haunts us. Its ruins are not reminders of the past. They are blueprints. We build our institutions on the same logic. If cruelty is efficient, call it justice. If obedience is useful, call it peace. If silence is profitable, call it virtue. But history leaves fingerprints. In the Forum, archaeologists found a marble plaque with faint Latin etchings. Lex mea vita tua. My law, your life. A phrase once carved above a courthouse door. It meant that law was sacred because it demanded sacrifice. That sacrifice was the body of the powerless. It still is. Rome's moral machine worked because everyone participated. The philosopher who rationalized, the citizen who looked away, the official who recorded, the slave who obeyed. Each made the system real. That's how evil becomes eternal, not through monsters, but through function. The bureaucracy doesn't vanish when the empire dies. It changes uniform, it speaks new languages, but it keeps the same rhythm: command, compliance, silence. The mark FVG burned into the woman's skin was never erased. It became symbolic, a template. Every state that brands, registers, or categorizes human beings carries that mark forward. The logic remains identical. Identify, isolate, justify. That's the true inheritance of Rome. Not conquest, but consent. A civilization that convinced itself obedience was moral. Rome's peace was an illusion built on exhaustion. Its law was a masterpiece built on ashes. Its virtue was a costume sewn from fear. And when the empire fell, the world didn't lose its order. It lost its memory of what that order cost. The next act of this story is not about empire, but about us. How every civilization repeats the same cycle, branding its victims, calling it order, burying their bones, calling it peace. Because the Roman system didn't die, it modernized. Rome fell, its statues crumbled, its legions vanished, but its logic endured. Buried not in ruins, but in paperwork. Every empire that followed borrowed Rome's blueprint: codify violence, rename it justice, and reward obedience with survival. The technology changed, the system didn't. When the empire collapsed, its laws migrated into Europe's bloodstream. The corpus juris civilis became the foundation of Western legal order. Its vocabulary of control, discipline, order, hierarchy, property resurfaced under monarchs, republics, and parliaments. Rome's chains became clauses. Its branding iron became the bureaucratic seal. In the colonial world, this inheritance became visible again. European administrators cited Roman precedents to defend conquest. They called enslaved Africans servi perpetui, permanent servants. They justified whippings as corrections, executions as civil enforcement, and forced labor as rehabilitation. The structure was identical: pain translated into productivity, control disguised as civilization, silence renamed as peace. The Empire of Marble had turned into an empire of paper. A slave plantation ledger from the 18th century lists workers not by name, but by number, identical to the Roman estate records that classified fugitives as fugitiva number 3. Different centuries, same syntax. Even the punishment for rebellion echoed the old formula. Branding on the shoulder, chains at the gate, public display, death for deterrence. The Romans would have recognized it instantly. Modern law inherited not Rome's morality, but its mechanism. The concept that suffering could be legally managed survived. The state became the new master. The courtroom replaced the courtyard. Where Rome branded slaves, the modern world registered citizens, ID cards, fingerprints, numbers, identification. Still the same ritual of belonging and control. Freedom remained conditional, not absolute. Prisons became the new mines, concrete instead of stone, guards instead of overseers. Time replaced labor as the instrument of punishment. The same logic applied: isolation, regulation, documentation. Pain reorganized, not erased. Inmates became invisible labor, building furniture, uniforms, even roads, exactly as the condemned once extracted ore for Rome's economy. The empire's cruelty had been streamlined into a policy of efficiency. The language remained eerily familiar. Officials spoke of rehabilitation, security, public order. These were Latin ideas with modern masks. Every phrase carried the echo of Pax Romana, peace through control. Every legal code carried Rome's ghost. Even the phrase rule of law traces back to the imperial ideal that justice meant obedience. Law was not protection, it was proof of power. Rome's legacy shaped the modern conscience too. We inherited its moral confusion, the belief that legality equals goodness, that what is written cannot be wrong, that suffering is acceptable if it serves a system. This is why nations still defend cruelty as procedure, why injustice persists when written down neatly in files. Because the Roman habit survives, documenting horror until it looks rational. In museums, visitors stare at slave collars behind glass and say, "That was barbaric." But outside, the same logic breathes. In detention centers, debt prisons, sweatshops, and surveillance grids, where bodies are still tagged, timed, and priced. The empire has no capital now. It is everywhere law becomes ritual, and empathy becomes risk. What Rome discovered was not the art of conquest, but the formula of stability through compliance. It understood that you don't need to kill dissent, you only need to regulate it. That is why the empire never truly died. It changed uniforms, learned new languages, moved into institutions. Its temples became courts, its priests became administrators. Its gods, order, profit, control, remained untouched. Modern governments speak of transparency, Rome spoke of justice. Both meant the same thing: visibility without accountability. The empire always wanted to be seen, but never questioned. The historian Edward Gibbon once wrote that Rome fell because of luxury and decay. He was wrong. Rome didn't collapse. It outsourced itself. Its systems migrated into every modern state that prized order over empathy, procedure over truth. We still live inside its shadow, a republic of laws built upon the bones of the lawful dead, a civilization that measures humanity by compliance and still believes silence is proof of peace. The Romans built their world from stone. We built ours from documents. But the architecture is the same. Columns of data instead of marble, ledgers instead of scrolls, and beneath it all, the same quiet machinery of obedience. Next comes the final reckoning, when we return to the question that opened this story. If Rome, the peak of law and order, turned pain into policy, what happens when the modern world repeats that pattern, but forgets to call it cruelty? Rome's body died. Its reflection did not. Every empire since has looked into that reflection and seen itself civilized. History calls it progress. But beneath the new flags, the same equation remains. Obedience equals order. Order equals virtue. Virtue justifies violence. That formula has outlived marble, language, even belief. Because it works. Rome understood a secret most governments still follow. You don't control people with fear of death. You control them with the fear of disorder. Once people equate chaos with evil, they will protect their chains. The modern world did not reject Rome. It perfected it. We still build systems that worship order and punish deviation. We just call them institutions. Airports, prisons, schools, borders, each runs on Rome's principle of visible obedience. Every uniform, every surveillance camera, every checklist is the same logic reborn. The empire no longer needs an emperor. It needs compliance. The difference between a slave collar and an ID badge is vocabulary. Both prove belonging. Both record value. Both demand visibility. We say it's protection. Rome said the same. The philosophers of control have always disguised cruelty as necessity. In the 1st century, Seneca called pain moral correction. In the 20th, bureaucrats called it state security. Both believed that power must hurt to preserve order. The real danger of Rome was never its brutality. It was its reasonableness. It made cruelty sound intelligent. When violence is rationalized, it stops looking like violence. It becomes maintenance. The guard becomes civil. The victim becomes statistic. Every empire claims to be different. Britain had its civilizing mission. France had its republic. America has its freedom. But under each flag lies the same moral code Rome perfected. We do harm to preserve peace. That is the logic of empire. To destroy in the name of stability. Rome used iron. We use economics, borders, and screens. Different tools, same architecture. Surveillance is the new amphitheater. Everyone performs obedience before invisible spectators. Every click, transaction, and movement is recorded. The digital version of the fugitiva ledger. The algorithm replaces the stigmata. The screen replaces the whip. The empire has become internal. We no longer need the spectacle of pain. We manufacture consent instead. The result is the same. The body remains obedient. The mind remains watched. Power no longer needs to be cruel to be total. It just needs to be rational. Rome's final lesson was that reason can justify anything if written clearly enough. That is why the worst crimes of history begin with paperwork. The Holocaust, the gulags, the camps, all had documentation, stamps, categories. Rome invented that logic. The belief that a signed document cleans the act it commands. The philosopher Foucault called it disciplinary power, the invisible continuation of Rome's public punishments relocated into institutions. Rome whipped the body to teach submission. Modern power trains the mind to obey without force. The method changed, the goal didn't. Every century thinks it is post-Roman. But every century still believes what Rome believed, that peace is the reward of hierarchy, that suffering is the cost of order, that law, once written, redeems violence. We live in Rome's afterlife, an empire of efficiency built on the same silence. Our world praises legality, measures productivity, punishes deviation, and calls it virtue. That is not civilization. That is Rome, reincarnated in glass and steel. The irony is that the Romans themselves feared this outcome. In the late Empire, a senator wrote, "When power learns to hide cruelty in reason, the gods will leave Rome forever." They did, but the reasoning stayed. Today we celebrate law, order, and empire as progress, but those words were once the vocabulary of oppression. Our civilization inherited not Rome's grandeur, but its grammar. Every government that punishes in the name of peace, every citizen who mistakes fear for safety, speaks fluent Latin without knowing it. So, what remains? The ruins are not warnings, they are mirrors. The Colosseum is not an artifact of barbarity. It is a model of administration, a place where death was managed, recorded, and justified. Our world does the same, only cleaner, quieter, hidden behind glass. Rome's cruelty was public. Ours is procedural. Rome burned the body, we audit it. And still, the question Rome never answered, the one carved beneath all its glory, remains ours too. How much suffering can a system justify before it stops being civilization? Rome's true victory was not its empire, it was normalization. It made cruelty ordinary, a tool of order, not evil. And once society accepts cruelty as routine, the system no longer needs tyrants. It sustains itself. In the late Empire, executions no longer drew outrage. Crowds yawned between deaths. The amphitheater had become habit, the calendar of obedience. Children grew up seeing blood as ritual, pain as proof that Rome still functioned. When horror becomes predictable, morality collapses quietly. That's how atrocity survives, not by force, but by repetition. You don't need to convince people it's right. You only need to make it familiar. Modern systems learned that perfectly. We call it procedure. Rome called it discipline. The words change. The comfort remains. When a government announces necessary sacrifices, when a company calls exploitation efficiency, when the public shrugs and says, "That's just how things are," They all echo the same imperial reflex: cruelty, normalized through language. Rome trained us to flinch at chaos, not injustice. It taught us to fear disruption more than wrongdoing. That is how control endures, through our preference for calm over conscience. A civilization begins to rot, not when it becomes violent, but when it can no longer recognize violence as wrong. Rome reached that point centuries before it fell. By the time emperors stopped ruling, citizens had already stopped feeling. The empire did not collapse because of decadence. It collapsed because it became numb. Historians call this moral fatigue. When cruelty becomes normal, society stops asking why and starts asking how much. How much punishment can preserve order? How much suffering can the system bear before it breaks? Rome never answered that question. It simply kept expanding until its cruelty outgrew its own logic. Law could justify pain, but not decay. When the empire's violence lost purpose, it turned inward, against citizens, soldiers, even emperors themselves. The machine that once ruled the world began consuming its operators. That's the inevitable end of any system built on obedience. Once no one can question it, it devours itself. Every bureaucracy has a threshold, a point where duty becomes complicity. In Rome, that point passed centuries before its fall. Citizens learned to obey, not to think. The Senate applauded massacres it no longer understood. Officials executed laws they no longer believed in. That was the empire's perfection. Cruelty so routine, it no longer needed intent. Today, we face the same temptation, the peace of indifference. We outsource suffering to prisons, borders, sweatshops, algorithms. We let systems inflict pain, so long as we don't have to watch. We convince ourselves it's necessary, rational, even humane. That's exactly what Rome believed. The empire's echo lives in every phrase like just following policy, every signature on a form that ruins a life, every shrug that says, "That's above my pay grade." That's what happens when conscience becomes procedural. The philosopher Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, the quiet efficiency of men who commit horror without hatred, who see cruelty not as crime, but as paperwork. That idea was born in Rome. The administrators of empire were not monsters. They were professionals, and professionalism without empathy is civilization's final disguise. Rome fell, but its mindset never did. It lives wherever legality and morality part ways, where law serves power, and power disguises itself as duty. It lives wherever obedience is praised more than conscience. It lives in every system that demands silence in exchange for peace. That's why the Roman ruins feel familiar. They are not ancient. They are architectural metaphors for our own world. Empty monuments built to hide the cost of order. The branded slave, the chained gate, the arena, the mines. Each was an instrument of normalization. Each taught generations that power could be cruel and still be right. And once that belief takes root, the empire never truly dies. So what remains of Rome is not marble or myth. It is method, the art of making atrocity acceptable, the perfection of moral anesthesia. And the lesson? The moment cruelty feels normal, history starts over. Because every empire, once it learns to call pain policy, becomes Rome again. Empires don't vanish. They fade into story, into pride, into curriculum. That is how cruelty disappears, not by denial, but by editing. Rome wrote the script for how civilizations forget. First, rename the victims, then glorify the system. Finally, turn the ruins into heritage. Every stone that once silenced screams now sells postcards. The Colosseum, once an engine of death, is a tourist line. No one smells the blood. They take selfies with it. That's how forgetting works. It becomes ritual. When Rome fell, its chroniclers didn't mourn the enslaved. They mourned the emperors. They wrote elegies for marble, not people. The voices of the punished were deleted before history began. Tacitus recorded revolts, not suffering. Suetonius listed names of rulers, not the branded. Even Christian historians, who inherited moral vocabulary, never rewrote the story from below. They kept Rome's hierarchy. They just changed the script. Memory has always been political. What survives depends on who writes. And the empire ensured that its scribes served power. Slaves had no paper. Women had no courts. The poor had no monuments. The result? History became autobiography of the victorious. Archaeology can recover bones, but not intentions. It can show us the whip marks, the shackles, the scars, but not the fear, the fatigue, the silence. That is the tragedy of historical evidence. It proves what happened, but not what it felt like. Rome knew that. It understood that to erase a life, you don't need to burn the body. You just need to leave behind records that make it look justified. The law became its own form of censorship. Every modern civilization does the same. We preserve symbols of oppression as heritage. We quote philosophers without mentioning their slaves. We praise architecture without naming its builders. We curate atrocities into aesthetics. That is the final luxury of power, to turn its crimes into culture. In the Museum of Roman Artifacts, a sign reads, "Tools of Punishment, 1st century AD." Below it, an iron collar rests under glass. Its inscription says, "I belong to my master." The label calls it a relic of social discipline. Even now, the sentence refuses to name what it is: a crime. This is how forgetting is engineered, not by ignorance, but by comfort. By words gentle enough to hide horror. By captions that say discipline instead of torture. We inherit that comfort. We mistake knowledge for understanding. We study Rome as if it were dead, because admitting it still breathes would indict us too. Forgetting has a cost. Every silence creates permission. Every euphemism builds immunity. And every time we call cruelty necessary, we reactivate the empire that wrote those words first. That is why the past doesn't stay buried. It keeps repeating, because our memory prefers beauty to guilt. Rome taught the world how to decorate its sins. It left behind a blueprint for absolution through culture. Build grand monuments. Quote, noble ideals. Document the violence with precision, so that accuracy can replace empathy. Modern civilization still follows that design. We build museums instead of justice. We light monuments instead of mourning. We polish what should have been confessed. Every empire builds its own myth of goodness, a story that turns domination into destiny. Rome's story still lives, that cruelty can coexist with progress, that law redeems violence, that memory can be curated without guilt. That is the true price of forgetting. We lose the ability to recognize ourselves in the crimes we inherit. The empire's ledger may have closed, but its pages keep reappearing in every border wall, every detention camp, every system that says it is unfortunate but necessary. History keeps sending us invoices, and every generation decides how much of that debt it is willing to see. The ruins are not warnings, they are receipts. Each column, each inscription, each fragment of law proves how efficiently civilization records pain, and how quickly it learns to look away. What Rome left us is not a past to remember, but a mirror to fear. Every empire ends the same way, not with invasion, but with accounting. When the Roman ledger finally closed, it wasn't marble that testified, it was bone. The empire that measured everything: taxes, grain, slaves, punishment, forgot to measure its own corruption. For centuries, it tallied labor, pain, and property with perfect precision, but never tallied guilt. That omission was its downfall. Rome collapsed not because of barbarians, but because its own arithmetic failed. A civilization that counted every coin and body, but never counted the cost of its conscience. The last generation of Roman senators still believed in legality. Even as famine spread, they held debates on tax law. Even as legions deserted, they discussed revisions to property codes. When the city burned, they rescued documents, not people. They mistook paperwork for permanence. That is how civilizations die, not by sword, but by the delusion that systems can outlast morality. Archaeologists found the proof centuries later. Warehouses filled with tablets listing slave transfers written in the same year the empire starved its citizens. The bureaucracy continued long after justice had stopped existing. Rome had built a machine, too efficient to know it was dying. Law kept recording even as life disappeared. That's the moral reckoning every civilization postpones. The moment when record and reality no longer match. When law becomes so detailed, it forgets why it was written. When cruelty continues out of habit, not conviction. Rome perfected that balance until the scales cracked. The state could punish rebellion, but not decay. The law could regulate suffering, but not meaning. And when a system loses meaning, it implodes under its own logic. By the 5th century, the symbols of empire still stood: the eagle, the senate, the courts. But their sentences no longer ruled men. They echoed in empty forums. Power had outlasted belief. One chronicler wrote, "The empire still writes decrees, but none are read." That was the true end, the silence after bureaucracy. And yet, Rome's story never disappeared. It fossilized into our institutions, our laws, our habits. Every time we call pain procedure, every time we confuse law with justice, we reopen the empire's books. The ledger was never destroyed, it was digitized. Its arithmetic still governs us. Who counts, who doesn't, who suffers, who profits, who records, and who is erased. But history doesn't close cleanly. Every buried truth resurfaces. Every erased name leaves a trace. Rome's ruins aren't relics, they're disclosures. Each brick whispers a name the law forgot to write. Beneath the forum lies a mass grave of enslaved laborers, buried without rights, without record. Above it, tourists walk, unaware they are crossing the empire's unbalanced books. The debt remains unpaid because history doesn't forgive, it audits. And every system built on suffering eventually meets its own arithmetic. You can hide cruelty behind order, you can sanctify it with law, you can rename it for centuries. But when the ledgers close, only the bones speak truth. The empire of law became the empire of silence. And when silence became unbearable, it collapsed under the weight of its own justification. No enemy conquered Rome. Rome drowned in its own paperwork. The mark FVG, fugitiva, meant runaway. But it could just as easily describe the empire itself, a civilization that ran from the truth until it could no longer run. Now the question it left us is simple and terrible. Can law exist without cruelty? Can civilization be built without victims? Or is every system destined to repeat Rome, to legalize suffering in the name of order and call the victims necessary? If the answer is no, then the ruins aren't warnings, they are predictions. Because the Roman ledger still balances, not in ink, but in us. Every generation adds its own line to it. Every silence, every justification, every cruelty disguised as duty. And one day, when our own systems crumble, when our laws are dust and our files unreadable, the same reckoning will come. The archaeologists of the future won't need scrolls or witnesses. They will find our bones, and they will say the same sentence we began with. In this empire, cruelty wasn't chaos, it was policy. When the ledger closed, the bones still spoke.